excited to have our panelists here to have this component, to have a little bit of discussion around, kind of take you guys behind the scenes, honestly, and talk a little bit, let you take part in some of the conversations that happen with artists and public historians when we're thinking about these projects, we're thinking about these things that we bring to the public. So I am really excited to have Cortina Jenelle Caldwell this evening. She's the founder and creative community organizer of Artists Designing Evolution, also known as the ADE Project. It's a decolonization-focused learning organization seeking to create a world beyond oppression and inequity by building capacity, opportunity, and community. And so I'm really, really excited to have her here and have her art mind to help us kind of work through some of this. And I'm really excited to have Vera Cecelski as well, one of my colleagues in the Division of State Historic Sites. She is the site manager at one of our sister sites, Historic Stagville. Historic Stagville is located in Durham. And so I'm not going to take too much time from that. What I wanted to do is kind of just dive right in. You know, when we do this program on site, people typically really love it or really hate it. Their initial reactions to the play can vary pretty widely. So I thought a good place for us to start, and I might actually give the question over to Cortina first, because Cortina's actually seen it in person at the site, and she's seen it virtually. So I thought that your perspective on it might be kind of interesting for people. So we're going to start there. I really just wanted to hear like a little bit about your reactions to the play and just some of your thoughts around it.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. As Kimberly shared, my name is Cortina Jenelle Caldwell, and I'm the creative community organizer of ADE Project. And one of the things that really is important to me is having this sense of community around what we call art, which I really think is just a different expression of life and our lived experiences. And I think for me, it's always really beautiful when I feel like I'm learning something new, whether it's a piece of history or just someone's story that I can resonate with or relate to in an artistic way. And so I think when I was watching it tonight, as opposed to being in person, I actually felt like it was more powerful somehow tonight, like seeing it in this way. I think that being in person, just to like go like, you know, super basic for a moment, but I think in person there are the distractions of, oh, it's cold, my feet might get wet, you know, if it's been raining. I know there was a year where it was like raining and we all had our umbrellas going from place to place. And I think sometimes when you're in person, there can be distractions like that really take away from or maybe add to the experience of this story. And there was something about tonight that felt really intimate. It felt like I was really there, which I really have to say was probably a feat in of itself for you all to really create this virtual experience that does feel really intimate and like you're right there by the fire and that you're there in the room when the history is being shared. So I have to say I'm still processing, but I'm also really blown away at just seeing how possible it is for us to still have these conversations and to still be engaging in artistic ways online, because you know, this might be a part of our reality moving forward. And so it kind of gives me more hope of how possible this pivot is. We don't have to stop creating and connecting with community and sharing with each other. So I'll stop there. But yeah, I'm very impressed and really just still processing so much of it. I can't wait to watch it again.
Obviously, I've never seen it in person. I really resonate actually with what Cortina just expressed of the feeling of sort of concentration that I was able to put into it, and the feeling of since so much of this piece is about drawing forward the power of individual stories, I'm sure there could be something powerful about that as a collective and as a group as well, but there was also something powerful to kind of sit as an individual and hold those individual stories. Yeah, I'd be intrigued to see what it feels like to be there in person.
I wanted to the public to be able to get an idea of some of the things that we're talking about behind the scenes. One thing that happens a lot, that you'll hear a lot within kind of our world, is people will often refer to African American history as difficult history. And so I'm interested to know your thoughts. So Vera, maybe we'll start with you. Your thoughts around that, and then I would love to hear, Cortina, after that, your thoughts around the idea of difficult history and maybe ways that you think maybe art and theater have an impact on that. So I'll turn that over to Vera.
Yeah, so we talk a lot about the phrase difficult history or hard history. You sometimes hear people use to talk about these stories. Often that language ends up being coded language for stories that haven't been told or haven't been included, or it ends up being coded language for audiences and for visitors that haven't been welcomed into our spaces. So, and haven't been included in the way that we tell the true narrative of the history of this country and of North Carolina at our historic sites and in museums and in public places. And so sometimes we often have conversations about pushing back a little bit on using a phrase like difficult history, because it's not the history itself that's difficult. It's the institutions that we've set up to tell that history that are uncomfortable telling those stories and are not supporting people to fully tell those stories. And it's the reactions that visitors have who have not been prepared to encounter these narratives. So my site specifically works on sharing the stories of enslaved people and their descendants. We focus on telling the histories of a plantation site through the lens of slavery and its legacies, focused on individual people's stories. That is truly difficult history to teach because it is traumatic, because it has deep connections to our current communities, and many people who come to our site feel connections between things that their communities are experiencing or that they themselves are experiencing in this history. And because many people who come to our site feel a deeply rooted tie between the narratives, the history, the stories that they hear from us as historians, and some piece of their identity and the way that they define themselves. So I think in that sense, difficult history is a fair way to talk about these stories, but I think also too often, difficult history gets used as this sort of coded language to push back and to shy away from actually telling those stories, when actually something that someone might label as difficult history should be assigned to us to open our institutions and open our narratives and use tools like art and theater and public history interpretation to tell these stories more deeply, right?
I feel like I just want to be like ditto to so much of what Vera has said. I'm really appreciating this energy, by the way. We haven't met before, so this is like our first time being in space together, which I love about Kimberly and also the work that you all do at Vance Birthplace. So I have to say that, you know, I think it's just so beautiful, I think, also to have this conversation right now, when I think that this has been a very trying, complex year for a lot of us for a lot of reasons. And we're having to be in this space of reimagining and thinking beyond what was normal or how things were before, you know. And as an artist, as an organizer, as a facilitator, like I have so many different hats that intersect with my work, and I claim all of the hats that or all the roles proudly, because I do think that we're in a place or a pivotal moment in our society and in our community where we're recognizing the necessary multiplicity of perspective, whether that's I have multiple perspectives or different seats that I can sit at depending on the table, that I can help build a new table with other people, that We're creating spaces that haven't previously existed, but we are, demanding to be included in part of that narrative in a major way. And for me, that is such a foundational part of my work, because I think that any sort of discrimination or oppression is an injustice, not just to those who are impacted by it, but to all of us, to our humanity. I think that, a conversation that you and I had earlier this year, Kimberly, what was it, the quarantine coffee with historians or something like that, which was amazing because, I was really at just kind of like my first kind of peeking my head back out from having to really go within and really do some really swift pivoting with not only what our work was going to look like as far as our programs and our offerings to the community, but then actually asking the bigger question of like, okay, so what is it our work to do now? And really having to check in with the communities that we work closely with. And as a cooperative, like that's our responsibility, is to make sure that we're constantly staying in touch with our community, that we are responding based on community need, and that really is at the center of what we do. Ade Project being about creating a world beyond oppression, this is our work and this is our conversation every single day. All of a sudden in June, there were thousands and hundreds and thousands of people also having the same conversation that many of us have, just maybe have had to have, because we've grown up as melanated people, unfortunately, in a society where there are these differences and there are these invisibilities, and our stories have either been told on our behalf or haven't been told fully. And so for me, as a Black Indigenous native of Western North Carolina, I find myself often really in some difficult conversations where people don't see the blind spots, especially when we're talking about equity and untold stories, and they don't see what's not being shared in the narrative, which is what I really appreciate about this presentation of art that you all have created with Venus and Vance, is that until you kind of looked under the rug or like peeked behind the closet door or whatever it might have been, like people weren't really asking those questions of, but what's not here? Who are we not hearing from? Whose voice isn't being heard? And I think that that's a responsibility that we all have, because otherwise, circling back to what I originally said, that it is really unfortunate for all of us to be having to move about our lives in ways that don't press us to stretch ourselves and have conversations with people who aren't like us, who have a different lived experience, just to not only see them as people, but also to broaden our understanding of the world, because the reality is we don't need to all be the same. We can all coexist and celebrate our unique differences. And I don't think that we have the luxury of continuing to ignore the fact that there are gaps, gaping holes in our history and our understanding of culture and community. And so I think 2020, just to kind of come to a close about this particular thought, but I think 2020 has definitely been a really eye-opening year in that way of really understanding, like, okay, well, if we change because we have to, then maybe it was always possible for the change to happen. Like if we include these stories, or we're saying people's names, we're recognizing the brutality and the violence and the impact because we have to see it, then maybe it was always there. And so what else can we do, or what else can be done to really be integrated and inclusive of people? So yeah, that's kind of what I would add to what Vera shared. But I just think it's a really important time for us to be sharing these stories and having this conversation.
I often have people come into the site at the Vance Birthplace. I'll have, white visitors that come in and have had people say, well, they're erasing history. By adding other narratives, you're erasing part of history. And that has been, I've been working in sites for museums for a while, and I'm used to pushback. That particular comment, I struggled with over this past year. I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts around how museums and historic sites can do a better job of telling a broad and inclusive narrative. How do we hold space and talk about Zebulon Vance? Because I do think he needs to be talked about, but how do we do that well? What are your thoughts around that? And maybe I'll pivot back to Vera for that one. Start there.
Ooh, that's a huge sweeping question, right? It's obviously something that we deal with some in our work at Historic Stagville, the site that I lead, that in some ways we certainly juggle the same kinds of parallels, right? Where there are very powerful white men and women who had some great degree of influence and certainly were like formative humans in the history of our site. But there are also, in Stagville's case, over 900 individuals who they enslaved and held captive and held in forced labor on that property. And so many of those stories have never been told. So how do we think about like holding those things in proportion to each other, right? If we're going to bring forward and tell more enslaved people's stories. I think there's a couple ways that I think we're in the middle of some of the same balancing, right? And I don't have an answer to it. I think a couple of the principles that we have tried to hold on to as we move into this work, or as we continue to kind of grow into that work, are always centering our interpretation on individual people and on relationships. So that when we are talking about Paul Cameron, one of the largest slaveholders in North Carolina, one of the richest men in North Carolina who enslaved these hundreds of people at Stagville, we never talk about him in isolation without talking about the way that his choices, his decisions, his wealth was based on the actions and the way that he perpetrated this system and the way that that impacted specific people, specific families, specific relationships around him in this community of people who were enslaved. So over and over again, we keep coming back to that every time we, especially when we're talking about something that an audience might be uncomfortable with or might have difficulty taking in, centering on a personal human story, the way that this history impacted someone, can often help break up a little bit of that resistance or that reluctance to connect with that narrative. So centering people in relationships, we also try to hold on to a principle of connecting the significance of telling the story in the past to an existing community or people in the present day. So trying to hold on to how an enslaved person at Stagville in 1850, how their experience echoes through the experience of their descendants in the 1890s and in the 1950s and in the present day, and how each of those generations has shaped the place that we live, and how that means that anyone living in our community today, the world in which they live has been shaped to some degree by these people, right? So kind of refusing to cut off the story in 1865 or 1900 or 1920 and keep that bridge forward to the present. And then when we talk about people like, I guess, our equivalents of Vance in this case, recognizing them, that removing them from the story removes the perpetrators from the story. And that is a power of the stories we tell, is to talk about these systems of power and who perpetrated them and the active decisions and choices and actions and violence and profit that those people had to participate in to push these systems forward. And if we push those people completely to the side of the story and focus, say, exclusively on only ever telling stories about enslaved people and their experiences, we are removing those people from their complicity in the system and the way that they should be recognized as perpetrators of these systems. And we're also missing an opportunity for people in the present day to understand the power systems that we are perpetrators in, or that we have complicity in, and the way that we should be able to use a story from the past to think differently about ourselves and the power structures we operate in. So those three things, I think, are some of the stepping stones that we are starting to piece together at my particular site.
I think originally my first, thought went to some of the conversations that you and I have had, Kimberly. And, I think one of the things that also has become more apparent to me over the past couple of years in being a founder, which is a whole thing apparently, and just the perception that comes with when you kind of step out to start something, and I think all of the perceptions that come with that. And I've really, over the past couple of years, have had some interesting conversations with people about power dynamics. And it's something that's come up a lot around who has the power to tell the story, who has the power to make the decisions and to decide who gets to be at the table or not, or who gets to share something or not. And I've kind of had that experience in my own way come up often with my work. And I've really, I say that to say over the past couple of years, I've also been on a very individual journey and remembering and honoring my own path as an artist, because not only is my work to work with other artists and educators and folks in community, but I have to stay connected to my own sense of creativity so that I can see that there's still always room to do things differently, or to think outside the box, or to be willing to go back to the canvas and say, okay, this is what this was before. How can we repurpose this? How can we upcycle this experience? And I think that in that way, art really does become a reflection of life, and I think a great tool for experience and expression. Because I think that we need to remember that we don't just have to work within the two options that we might have, that maybe there's a third or fourth option, or maybe there's an option that doesn't clearly exist yet. And I say that because I think that with museums, and also having this conversation about archives and research and cultural artifacts, I think that there has been a very clear focus that these things that are in our archives or on our shelves or in our spaces are things of the past. And I challenge that because as an artist, and I would say this about many people that I've worked with that are also artists, that we are also historians, that we very, at least the folks that I work closely with and that I know to be stellar, excellent, producers and crafters of art, is we want to know the history, we want to know those stories, we want to know the personal connection that's directly tied to my life experience, or the narrative, or the question, or the curiosity, or the challenge that I'm sharing with you about through my art, however that comes across. And I want to know the truth, and I'm curious enough that it's in me as an artist to really dig for those answers. And not only that, I realize how interconnected everything truly is. And in that way, I think that history and the past is always present. It's always living with us, because history has informed what we experience today. So I think that removing this perception that the things of the past are just kind of there and they're stagnant, and there's no life in them, or there's nothing that can be molded or reshaped or reformed in creative ways, I think is a disservice to those spaces, because then you kind of lose that immediate engagement with your audience, whether it's somebody stepping into a museum for a visit, or it's somebody coming into the library because they want to look at the archives. In like the North Carolina room, for example, people want to know, how is this relevant to me today? How has this impacted and shaped my life experience today? And then where do I see myself in this history? And I think in that way, especially as we turn the time dial on a new year, that it really is time more than ever that we figure out these ways to be more inclusive with our history and our narratives, and really call in community members either to fill these gaps with history, but also call in the creative community and the artists to really create things that, yes, they're going to be historical information, but how can we make this a living experience for people when they step into a museum? How can what's on the wall or on the shelf really be connected and engaging with students and youth of today, because they need this information, I think now more than ever. And for me as a millennial, the things that I know historically about the history of Buncombe County and Asheville and Western North Carolina and Southern Appalachia, and also the history of race and racism and systems of oppression, like all of these things I had to come by my own learning as an adult. I was never taught the full gamut of history in school. Even as somebody who has like gone through several years of school and has gone to graduate school, there was never really that sense of satisfaction or completeness in anything that I read that I felt either was inclusive of me or that didn't make me feel like, oh, that thing just happened back then. It doesn't have anything to do with right now. Like, that happened, you need to know it, and that's just what it is. You're in the present moment now. And so I really think that we have an opportunity to not only kind of look at our history and see who was in power, who had the control to say what got included or not in our archives and in cultural spaces such as museums, but then how can we maybe invite community, invite artists and other people that are ready to reimagine and recognize that history is always living, that every moment is eventually going to be part of history. And so it does us well to find the way that these two things can be married. And I think that our youth and our generations coming behind us absolutely need that, because I mean, just thinking about what is being taught in school today, I'm like, there's so much that's missing. And that's where it becomes the responsibility of those community spaces, such as museums and historic sites, and even community organizations like our Day Project, to say, it's time for something different to happen here, so that we actually can not have the same thing that we know has not been working continue to happen. And how can we step in and be those learning centers and those places of engagement and education, so that the people who are eventually going to be running our country and our communities have that sense of like holistic identity. And that, I think, is something that's really needed now more than ever.
We do have a question that's come through, and I wanted to remind our attendees at this point, if y'all have any questions, anything at all, feel free to submit the questions in our Q&A window if you want to ask anything specifically. This one kind of goes to Cortina, what you were just talking about, but it says, this program uses shadow theater and crankies. Can communities reclaim sites like Vance or Stagville through art? What other form might that take? So I think some of that, Cortina, goes to what you were saying, but if you have anything else you want to add to that, great.
Yeah, I mean, so there's so much I want to say. I'm excited about the work that we're going to be doing in the future. I have to say, with Vance Birthplace, because I do really believe in this, and I think that there's so many different ways that we could talk about art. I think that whenever people hear that I'm an artist, I think sometimes the immediate assumption is like, oh, what do you paint? Or like, you're a visual artist, so like maybe like you're doing paintings. And I think that it's so interesting to me, because I think there's so many things that we go about our days and just do in our everyday life that actually it's an art form. Like they're like living creatively and like living in community is an art form in of itself. I think, so much of our work is about the art form, as opposed to art for the sake of just making art, right? So I would just say there's so much that can be done, and I think the possibilities are endless. So, just keep in mind that art does include visual art, but it also does include, it includes theater, spoken word and poetry and words were my first love. And that's a lot of how I express my artistic gifts. I also recently got into theater, and I'm going to be in my first production later this month. And, I think that those two things are really powerful to add to any sort of visual art. I also think about music. think about culinary art. What were the foods of the times? How can we recreate some of the foods and the recipes that people were making? What about agriculture? That is an art form that is very cultural and has a lot of history, but also it's definitely influencing us today because some of these practices and ancient traditions have been lost. And just recognizing the art form in that and not having that information as readily available as we might like. So I think just, having that broad understanding that there's so much that entails art when we think about it, and there's so much that we can do to really transport ourselves back in time, but also recognize, what were those influences on our lives today, and how can we get curious about things that we don't know enough about yet.
There is a lot of conversation in the museum world about how you balance things when you're interpreting, like Christmas and the story of slavery. And so I'd be interested to know just kind of your thoughts around, as Cortina was talking about all the different art forms, like even with the cooking and all that, how do we balance, the seriousness isn't necessarily the right word that I'm looking for, but respect, a level of respect, but also Christmas. So I'm interested to know your thoughts around that.
Yeah, I think like some of the other things we've talked about tonight, I think myself and many of my colleagues and the team that I work with at my site are really I would say we've been in about 18 months of reckoning at this point. Certainly, as Cortina said, like many of the outside forces of 2020 have accelerated some of that change and, some of the opportunities to bring other folks into that reckoning with us and push that reckoning forward. And I think one of the enduring questions that we hold at our site is what do public programs look like at a place that has such a heavy history of violence and trauma and horror, and a place where we know that many of our visitors are not necessarily prepared to encounter that history, or do not necessarily feel that history at our site. And yet we also have visitors for whom, in equal measure, a visit to the site, simply walking on the grounds, is an incredibly heavy and perhaps horrifying, perhaps enraging, perhaps healing, but intensely emotional experience that is totally disconnected from the sort of from the way many of our other visitors might perceive the site. So we're constantly thinking about what kind of programming can we offer to people in this space, right? And what is the responsible way to use these spaces? I don't have a pat answer to that. I have a lot of big questions about that, and a lot of community partners and a lot of descendants and a lot of colleagues that I am constantly talking to about that. I think as y'all have with this program, we have really come to art and to deep collaboration with artists as one way to facilitate programming and experiences at our sites. I can't talk about most of what is on deck in that regard because it's due to be announced in the next few months, but we have at least two major artist collaboration initiatives that'll be lifting off in 2021 and more to come beyond that, that are about thinking about immersive or connective experiences that we can create for people at the site without the sort of traditional trappings of a historic site, the sort of stereotypical historic sites programming, which is nostalgic life in ye olden days, as I would say holiday programs fall into, or a book reading and a lecture that are sort of drier and more academic. And neither of those really suit the appropriate tone and the honor that we need to give to the place that we keep.
So before I pitched this towards Cortina, we did have a related question to this that says, related question for Vera, can you reimagine this program around your site? You know, how would your community respond to this type of story?
Yeah, interesting. I can imagine parts of this programming at my site. I personally, Kim, I'm not sure if I've talked to you about this recently. I've spent a lot of 2020 thinking about the resonances of what it means to have people ask about and talk about and generally think about what we really talk about when we talk about ghosts at historic sites, and specifically ghosts at historic plantation sites. So that was the part of this piece that resonated with me the most, because I think that while we have a policy at our site to do nothing that approaches like telling a ghost story, we feel that that doesn't represent the actual horror, the actual suffering of people on the site in an appropriate way. But we often have visitors that ask questions about ghosts and haunting. And that is a really evocative opening to talk to those people about, for some people, ghost narratives or narratives about haunting is an opening to talk about two things, to talk about horror, which people might not be comfortable talking about, which is often part of those stories, and also is an opening for us to talk about when you ask if this place is haunted, if what you're asking is, are there things that happened here that are still around looking over our shoulders? Yeah, it is. It doesn't mean it's a ghostly specter, right? It's white supremacy. It's all the other things that we've inherited from this history that are still standing in the room with us, right? And they're inside all of us. And I'm really intrigued by the pieces of this program that speak to that. So I guess I can see that. I think that some of my audience would really push back, and I'm curious to know if y'all have received pushback against being asked to stand in the shoes of Zebulon Vance, and being asked to stand in that perspective. And I think the audience of my site and the folks that come would be more resistant to that and would need perhaps some more framing or some more conversation around that specific component, because I think we would have, if we had visitors to our site who were being asked to, who felt that the experience was about them seeing things through an enslaver's eyes or through a member of the Cameron family, we would have some folks who would be very uncomfortable with taking that position. And I don't necessarily think that's untenable, but I think we would have to think differently or think in my particular site's case about like really opening a conversation with our audience specifically about why that choice is made and kind of the intent in doing that, which obviously y'all do to some degree, but I just,
I can definitely say that, like I said, people typically love it or hate it. But when it comes to this perspective of Zebulon Vance, that is something that actually came up in our first virtual program of Christmas Carol last Saturday. Someone was mentioning, what about looking at it from the perspective like standing in the shoes of Venus? And I'm like, oh, well, then you run into some, you have some difficulties there as well, right?
Right.
When you're asking someone to stand in someone's shoes, that's a difficult thing. So I will say, when I say people love it or hate it, I mean, I've had multiple people cry in my office for completely different reasons. So, it's something I think that we definitely have to think about. And that's why we really honestly look forward to the feedback from our visitors and our guests, because we change this program every year. This year is really different than it was 4 years ago. It's a really different program. So, Cortina, I was going to bring
I
it
have
back.
some things to add. I have some things to add to this. Yeah. Well, and I'm going to add in a layer that hasn't been brought in yet, but I think is very just inherent for me because it's such a big part of my culture. And I think that in some ways, Vera spoke to this, and I just want to name it explicitly, is that I think in the Black Indigenous POC cultures, that for a good amount of cultures, as far as we can trace back, there is some recognition and welcoming of our ancestral connections that we recognize. And I'll speak for myself. I'm practicing speaking from the I more and more around things like this, because I can't necessarily speak to somebody else's experiences of their ancestral lineage or their ancestral line. But for me, as somebody who identifies as Indigenous, and I say Indigenous specifically because I know my family to be, at least from 5 or 6 generations that we know of, to be from Western North Carolina. I know my great-great-grandmother to be a woman who was not only Indigenous or Cherokee, but also was a Black woman. And I think that I think for me, seeing her picture without knowing her name or knowing her story, and having some like memories of questions and unanswered questions when I was younger, come flooding back to me as I was really on this path to figure out what is my contribution to my community and my work, and realizing that I couldn't contribute anything if I didn't know who I was, and that really that sense of belonging and that sense of place was going to come from my sense of identity. And so I had to start at a place where I knew my roots were planted, and I still have many unanswered questions. I know my ancestral line to be from West Africa, and to be specifically from the Yoruba culture. And so I have, the privilege in that way of having gotten curious enough to start doing some digging and to really understand what's in my DNA. I still have those unanswered questions of what my great-great-grandmother's name was, or what sort of things that were involved in her day-to-day. And I know her to be an enslaved person. My grandmother was an indentured worker for quite some time in Rutherford County before she, maybe I think at 7 or 8 years old, stopped working as a sharecropper on a plantation. Her and her siblings would get picked up every day by this older white man in a truck, and he would come to their house and pick them up, and they would go to the field and they would pick cotton and they would work. That's something that's really painful for her to talk about. And so there's still unanswered questions there for me and for many of us. And I go back to that my place as an artist, and that my curiosity as an artist is really what led me down this path to want to know what were the practices, like what was the music, what was the cultural pieces, because I know that there were contributions that not only my family, but many other Black or Indigenous families made to this region. And it's really difficult to trace that back in a very direct way. And so it makes it really difficult to have this sense of place and sense of belonging. And I think that, one of the things for me that really also became clear is that, I'm a descendant of her. I am doing the work that maybe she at the time couldn't do. That my liberation is directly tied to as far as she could get. And then that baton got passed to my grandmother and my mother and then me. And then until one of us, picked it up and took it a little bit further than the last person could go. And so with that being said, I think I go back to what I said earlier, which is a different level or a different perspective or lens of looking at this, but history is very much living with us all the time. It's not disconnected from our present moment, and it's certainly not disconnected from my identity, my culture, or my traditions, even if there has been this disruption in what I know or what I can find out. And so when people come to spaces and they're asking about, are there spirits here? Are there ghosts here? What I would say a bigger question is, what were the cultural practices of the people, and how can we heal the land? How can we really take healing and knowledge and respect into spaces where we know there's been harm done, and really do the work of sharing these stories so that there can be peace there. I think that it's I could go so many different places with this question, but I do want to say that sure, it could be classified as mystery or as horror or as this kind of like thrill-seeking thing, and also realize that these were people's livelihoods and lives, and that when there wasn't peace for them, that trickled down in the family line and in the DNA, and also it means that there's things that need to be righted on the land and in these spaces, and the only way we can do that is if we kind of see who are the people to call back into these spaces that might have had family connections to spaces. And for that reason, I know that it was absolutely my ancestors and people that came before me that in whatever way brought me to Vance, and brought me to that site. And I just had such a profound experience there, and a lot of it I don't have words for, but I did in some ways have this sense of peace, or like I had known that place, and that's something that can't really be explained, but it's a very real thing. And we have to tell these stories because we have these fractures in lives and livelihoods to repair. It's not just about what we can see on paper or what we can read about. These were actual people's lives, and it affects us today.
I think there is some shift happening. I think there are some changes in public expectations to hear inclusive stories and to hear everyone's history included, and specifically to hear the stories of people who've traditionally been pushed to the margins of the narrative of historic sites. And I think there is a growing amount of the public that is asking for, demanding, speaking out, helping hold historic sites to account by asking those questions and pushing sites to include those narratives. But I don't think that this is necessarily a linear narrative of progress. And I think that history, I think that many parts of this history continue to be deeply contested, and some folks who are not receptive to those histories, being exposed to them or encountering them in spaces sometimes causes people to become, unfortunately, more entrenched and more resistant to hearing those narratives. So it is a sort of slow and steady step. And I also think, hopefully, that many of our museums and historic sites are not just starting to tell these stories, but are getting better at telling them with ethics and with empathy and with honor. And so hopefully we are all becoming not just telling more of these stories, but becoming more effective at telling these stories and telling them in a way that is affecting and is empathetic and does bring more people into connection with them. But we as a field are scrambling to catch up at the tools to tell these stories, as well as actually including them, because they have been so chronically dismissed and untold for generations. I
feel like we're in the shift. I feel like change is possible as long as we decide that it is. I think that that's the beauty in being creative. I think that's the beauty in infusing spaces and storytelling with art, and really using as many mediums as we want to. We don't have to, just continue to select from the options that we're given. And I think that if there's no other time that that's more true, I think we've seen that this year. So I really hope that this spirit of cooperation, as I like to say, and creativity continues into next year and the year after that. And I just think about how I have a personal and professional responsibility to do as much as I can to contribute to bettering our community and leaving it better than I found it. And I'm excited to do that with other people. So I really think that's the shift more than anything, and just getting curious along the way.
Well, I really appreciate your time. Before everyone leaves this evening, I will say we typically end our program on site. We give everyone an ornament. We tell them, we say that we don't know if Zebulon Vance was ever visited by the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future, obviously. And we don't know that if he was, if he would have even changed his views or policies or actions. But bringing it full circle to, as we've discussed with, relating history to present day, we as a community do have the ability now still to change how we move forward, to continue to question, to continue to think, to continue to grow. And so I leave everyone with a virtual ornament and ask you to think about ways that you can go out and create empathy, and to think about empathy and how to take that forward from here. So with that, I just want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. Thank you, Cortina. Thank you, Vera. And I hope everyone has a good rest of the night.